Oh, welcome to my podcast. Today's guest is Nicola Clayton. She's a professor of comparative cognition at the University of Cambridge. Now, I had the honor and pleasure to spend part of my PhD in her lab while I was writing about animal consciousness as a philosopher. There's, of course, a useful experience to see how actual scientists try to get into the minds of animals, try to understand how their cognition works, how their minds operate. So, Nikki, I'm very happy to have you on this podcast today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Walter. It's wonderful to see you again
Yeah.
and to hear you.
So, you're perhaps famous, we could say, for your research on Corvids in particular, for really, yeah, here in the background, we can see some nice pictures you have in your room, for really pushing sort of our recognition, how smart birds can actually be. In the past, perhaps people would say things like, as stupid as a bird, but now that's perhaps no longer the insult it was once.
Or even bird brain.
Yeah,
Now we might think of them as brainy birds.
that's right. Now, when did you start becoming interested in birds?
Mm, Before I can remember, my mum
Hmm.
says I was about 18 months. I,
Wow.
I discovered that I had legs and how to use them. I never bothered with crawling. I used to shuffle on my bum. And then I discovered how legs work and I realized I could walk and dance. And at the same time, I discovered that there were these cool creatures out there called
Hmm.
birds, and they could move really elegantly and they could fly.
Interesting. Yeah.
But
Now,
my first memory is when I was 4, but my mum says it's
hmm.
about 18 months of age.
Yeah, did you own birds at any time as a kid?
I was a bird watcher, so I
Yeah.
used to like to go outside and watch them.
Oh, that's nice. And then you
And I've
decided,
just completed the RSPB bird watch because you know
yeah,
they
right.
have one every year.
How
So
old were you when you completed that?
my first one, I think probably 4.
Oh, wow.
I started reading when I was 3, so I
Yeah.
think my first one when I was 4, and I did the last one on Sunday. I was very disappointed this year, was very worried because in my hour of birdwatch, I didn't see any starlings. But
Hmm.
luckily, the starlings came back to say hi today because I'm really worried. Starlings are in a massive decline. So
All right, yeah.
very concerned when I didn't see any of them in my birdwatch, but they came to
Hmm.
feed today. I put some mealworms and some cheese out, and
Nice, yeah.
they came to say thank you. So pleased, yeah.
That's lovely. Um, so did you early on think that you might become a bird researcher at some point?
Well, I just knew I wanted to do birds. And so
Yeah.
when I applied to university, to Oxford, I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't sure what to apply for. So I applied for zoology, but also psychology with philosophy. I'd have
Hmm.
really liked to do zoology and psychology combined, but Oxford didn't do that course.
Hmm.
Neither did Cambridge.
Yeah.
I only applied to Oxford. And I met the wonderful John Krebs, Lord Krebs
Hmm.
Whiten, and he told me that if I chose zoology and I was lucky enough to get in, that he'd be able to help me find out more about birds and supervise a bird project. And
Yeah.
I did get into his college, Pembroke College, and his promise was even better than his word. So I hung out with him a lot and learned an awful lot from him. And I did a very cool bird project, which was actually kind of combining zoology and
Hmm.
psychology. Of course, they don't have a zoology department anymore. It's now School of Biological Sciences or School of Biology. But in those days, it used to be zoology and botany. And I love plants too. I could have also imagined myself doing a research project on orchids, but the problem with orchids, beautiful though they don't have quite the same cognitive skills, and they don't.
Hmm.
And I'm a movement junkie, so
Right. So perhaps we start with a controversial question there, where I'm not sure you've seen this, but now there's a couple of researchers who are really pushing for the cognitive abilities of plants that have gone unrecognized. What's your stance
well,
on that?
Well, I have seen this stuff, and it is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, it's in a similar vein as arguments about language. It depends on how you define it.
Mm.
You're the philosopher.
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell grandma or grandpa how to suck eggs, especially since I'm allergic to them. But you're the philosopher, but it really depends how you define it. If you define cognition as a psychologist, then I don't think they have cognition.
Mm.
But it's always fabulous to push the boundaries and question what you mean by things and to look at things from other perspectives. So in that regard, I think it's fabulous. And it is flexible and it is information transfer. It's just not cognition the way a psychologist
Yeah.
would define it, for better or for worse.
I think that's natural to think that really the boundaries between behavior, cognition, complex behavior, perhaps consciousness, these are kind of blurry boundaries where things come in degrees, right?
Oh, especially if you look at those pesky little cuttlefish and other
Yeah.
members of the cephalopods, molluscan phyla, because they really push your boundaries.
Mm.
They do have a brain, but only like a third of the neurons are in the brain, the rest
Mm.
are in the arms. And there's something that gets me completely confused. I mean, should you wish to eat octopus? I'm not advocating one does, but should you wish to eat them, why in the restaurant do they call them octopus tentacles? Because octopus don't
Mm.
have tentacles. Cuttlefish and squid do, but in octopus, they're arms. But I guess if you said, would you like to have some arms for dinner? People
Mm.
might be a bit more like, oh, I'm not sure I want that.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
want some brain in my soup. Maybe not.
Hmm. Yeah,
I
we
don't,
don't really we
but
we we sell animal eggs, but we don't call them arms typically.
you know,
Hmm.
anyway, I digress, but you know what I mean. Anyway, my point is they have arms. Octopus don't have any tentacles.
That's right. So I guess the way many think about animal cognition is they made so members of the public say they might imagine animals as sort of smaller humans that just have a different body, right? But perhaps that's not how you think about it. We have to change our perspective there.
Well, I think there's two interesting things about that you just said about that. One is the animals and one is the body. So in terms of animals, I think the old-fashioned view of evolution was that it was a ladder with these steps,
Hmm.
and with humans at the top of the ladder, and sponges at the bottom. And you make these transitions up. So a sponge is stupider than a frog, that's more stupid than a snake, that's more stupid than a chicken, that's more
Hmm.
stupid than a pig, that's more stupid than a monkey, that's more stupid than a human. And of course, we now know that the scala naturae, as it's called in evolutionary biology, is wrong. But of course, if you think about it in that line, it looks like it's a linear progression,
Hmm.
and evolution could only work one way, through what's called homologous evolution or shared common ancestry. But of course, if you think of evolution as it's now more accurately thought to be a better depiction in terms of a branching tree, it means that very distantly related animals could, in principle, be just as clever,
Hmm.
but they've evolved it either independently through completely different means or convergently because they have similar selection pressures operating on them, even with completely divergent bodies,
Hmm.
brains. And of course, the whole idea that some people have come up with is the idea that some distantly related animals, such as dolphins, might be just as clever as our closer cousins, the great apes. Others have argued the case for elephants within the mammalian class, and others have argued the case for parrots, And of course, Nathan Emery, my husband, and I have argued the case for the Corvids, that although they're birds and they shared a common ancestor with mammals over 300 million years ago, some amniotes, that despite very different bodies and brains, they actually have similar types of intelligence. And we argued probably through a process of convergence, by which we meant that things come together because they have similar selection pressures despite divergent brains. So you could think of the brains as being my elbows and the interleaved fingers being the brains that have solved similar problems. Things like having to make and use tools to get foods you can't otherwise reach, keep track of foods that either ripen or perish or both, and all these social shenanigans, which is not just being in a large crowd, but interacting with others, networking, understanding who are your friends and who are your foe, and how to get some of your foe to be some of your friends if you say the right things in the right places and at the right times. So you can see how all these things could integrate together, because essentially you could distill it down to being questions about understanding other times and other minds. So understanding the information you have in the here and now, although it's relevant of its own right, might also be applied to thinking about how other selves think, or how yourself might think differently in the future, and how it might have thought different in the past. How understanding those different kinds of spatio-temporal perspectives might allow you to have a broader ability to think about how you interpret what's going on now, than if you only literally interpreted what you see before you.
I think that's a great point, and perhaps it moves us to this kind of methodological question where when different animals have all these different cognitive abilities, clearly they're not necessarily at least trying to solve the same problems we as humans are trying to solve, but we want to assess how intelligent they are. So as a comparative psychologist, I'm sure that's quite a challenge. How do you design experiments in order to probe those abilities that fit to the species that you're trying to investigate?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if we just take a couple of stupid examples, if I want to compare a goldfish and a chimpanzee, well, if I take the goldfish out of the fish tank for more than about 15 minutes, it's going to be very stressed. And within 20 minutes, it'll be dead. And if I put a chimpanzee in a fish tank, well, probably it will still live, but the fish tank will be no more. But either way, I'm going to have two either dead or very stressed animals. And any kind of test that I perform on them will be completely meaningless. So, the most salient way to go about these things is to try to think, is there some kind of test you can do that's ethologically valid for the animal? So, it's something that relates to what they do naturally wild. And are there aspects of that you can distill out, you can abstract, that you can apply to different animals?
Now, sometimes, at least in this field, that perhaps that's more of a niche field, you sometimes hear the argument that we shouldn't rank the intelligence of different animals. They're all smart in their own way for the unique problems they're trying to solve. But when you say things like, oh, birds are very clever or dolphins are very clever, we get this convergent evolution of intelligence. That doesn't seem to be the view you hold, at least. What is your position there?
Well, firstly, I would say that I disagree with the statement that all birds are very clever. I think there are some birds that are very clever and some birds that aren't so clever. I wouldn't put my money on ostriches if I was the highest IQ intelligence prize. But I would levy the same argument against mammals. Would you really want to say, well, rats and humans are equally intelligent in their own ways? Well, as a psychologist, I wouldn't be
Mm,
convinced about that, and probably rats are one of the smarter of
right.
the non-primate mammals, to be fair. So I'm not picking on rats. I'm trying to make the point that I don't think they're all equal. I mean, again, you know, it's as we started with the beginning when you asked about the plants, it really depends on how you want to define intelligence. If you want to say it's about being able to solve problems and survive in their natural world, then there probably are all equal, or maybe some are better than others in certain kinds of environments. But in which case, I think we need to not just be phylogeneticist about this. I'm not sure how you say the equivalent of sexist or racist or thinking about
Right.
phylogeny, but I'd put my money on viruses if we're going for survival skills and flexibility and speed of adaptations. So that's that, and they're not animals or plants or fungi or bacteria. They're completely different class, but they're still living organisms, of course. But I think when psychologists talk about cognition, and I tend to use cognition and intelligence interchangeably, but perhaps I shouldn't. I think that when psychologists talk about cognition, they mean flexible decision making that's controlled by processes operated by the mind. And I think for most biologists, at least, in this argument, the mind is associated with brain processes, possibly neural circuitry, but definitely brain processes. That's where we might sort of hone in on a distinction between things that seem to be very adaptive and brilliant for survival and things that seem to involve the kind of intelligence most of us mean when we talk about cognition.
I think it's very useful to say, look, there's a sensible middle ground between a speciesist conception. What's the name of that kid?
He's called Moriarty, and he's
Moriarty,
a little
yes.
bit naughty.
I think I've met
He
him.
says he's cleverer than a rat. It's not quite clear why he's clever or how he knows it, but he assures me he is.
Nice. No, I think that makes that's a great addition to the podcast, I think. What did I want to say? Yes, I think it's from what you said, I think we can have this sensible middle ground between a speciesist conception of intelligence, where we just compare the abilities of animals to what we do as humans, and then a conception that's just completely relative to the different species and their problem-solving capacities. And I think then we can ask for things like, well, in which sort of cognitive, perhaps tasks or challenges are some species actually superior to animals? Do you have good examples there where animals can surpass human skills?
Eating.
Eating.
So if you look at the Corvids, members of the crow family that hide food for a living, I mean, you've worked in my lab, Walter. You've seen the birds. How many of them are obese? 0, right?
Yeah.
If we look at human societies, how many human societies have you lived in recently where you could honestly claim that you've not seen anyone that's obese? I would suggest 0.
Yeah.
So, you know, humans are very intelligent and they understand that being really fat, you know, BMI of 35 or plus, is not healthy. But that doesn't mean there aren't loads of people out there with high BMIs. And, you know, look at the pandemic. Loads of people got a lot chubbier in the pandemic. Hopefully, most of them have lost a lot of the excess weight since. But we all knew we shouldn't do it, but we did. But as a bird, you can't afford to. Now I've switched, so listeners might be thinking, just criticised Walter a few minutes ago for saying, but I mean corvid, not bird. Well, I'm saying birds because most birds, other than ostriches or a few extreme, most birds spend most of their time flying. And if you have to fly a lot and not in an aeroplane yourself, then you can't afford too much excess baggage.
Right, so I guess that's much more costly for flying animals in terms of energy expenditure.
Exactly. And how many fat bats do you see?
Yeah.
Not just picking birds. So one thing we know about the corvids, of course, is they hide food for the future. Some other birds do that, but not all birds. But what we also know is that they're better about planning for the future. So they're able to dissociate their current motivational state from their future one. So they're able to go, well, I'm hiding food right now, but I'm hiding it for the future. So I need to think about what I will get back when the future finally arrives. Whereas most of us humans, myself included, certainly I'm probably one of the worst at this, I'm rubbish at buying sensible food if I go grocery shopping when I'm hungry. You know, the chocolate bars, the crisps and nuts, the gin and tonics all get in the trolley somehow. Who knows? I mean, I've only got 2 hands, but all of a sudden the trolley is full of these things that are really yummy, especially when I'm hungry. But actually, you know, just eating crisps and nuts and chocolate bars and gin and tonic
Often we
for
talk
several
about
weeks. Not a good idea, maybe. Over
often
Christmas may be fine, but not,
often we talk about humans as being so much smarter than animals and animals being dumb. But we humans make terrible decisions, right? That's a good example.
Yeah. Oh, well, I tried to stay away from political decisions, tried to stick with science. But I think the food one is, there are other analogies, and I'm sure all the listeners and viewers will be picking up on those right now.
Now, perhaps using those examples of trying to hide food for the future, I've seen some interesting experiments happening in your lab where some of the corvids were deliberately trying to hide it in a way that others couldn't see it, as well as trying to fake bury it somewhere to really mislead others. And that suggests some perhaps theory of mind capacities that they have some recognition of perhaps the thought processes going on in others. Now, perhaps it's a bit controversial and we need to do more experiments there. But at least there's some interesting research going on in your lab there at the moment, right?
Thank you. Well, it's also why I mentioned the idea of other minds.
Yeah, so
Reality also caches, by the way. He spent hours last night with a stick, hiding it under the door frame, and then looking at each side of the door to check that it was hidden appropriately.
Right, yeah. Yeah, anyone who owns animals, I think they can gain this recognition of quite complex abilities. Sometimes we might anthropomorphize it too much, but perhaps there's much more intelligence that we might give credit for, perhaps. Now, you had a paper published, I think, last year about magic tricks and Corvids' reactions to that. Perhaps you could tell us about that.
Well, it relates back to what you said at the beginning about thinking about other bodies as well as other brains or minds. So we did some magic effects with the jays because jays hide food for a living, but they also steal other birds' caches of hidden food, and they also protect their own caches from onlookers. And we noticed that some of the ways in which they protect their caches seem to have a number of similarities with how magicians conceal things from others. And I know this because my tango partner is also a professional magician, Clive Wilson, a member of the Magic Circle.
Yeah.
And in fact, he's giving a Zangwill seminar in the psychology department this Friday, which I'm hosting. So, some of the things the jays do is that they as you alluded to, they make false caches using sleight of beak. Obviously, they don't have hands, but they can pretend to move things, sometimes move them and often just pretend to without moving them using their beak. They can also use their wing to cover over the caches and hide them from others' view, as well as using standard obstacles like rocks and trees to hide the view of others. So we performed some magic effects. It was led by my then PhD student, Elias Garcia Pellegrin, and my postdoc, Alexandra Schnell, and then with Clive Wilkins and I. And we showed that the jays were fooled by some effects, just like humans are. But it was only ones where hands seemed to look like wings. So if it's something where you use a hand to conceal, in a way a wing can work, the jays were fooled by it. And of course, if you think about what magic effects really tap into, well, you have a memory of what you think you saw, and you have an expectation of what you think is going to happen next. And it's that expectation that the magician violates. And that's what leads to surprise. If you don't have an expectation, or your expectation is exactly what you're going to see, it's not a magic effect. So it has to be an expectation that turns out to be false because the magician's violated it. That's what causes the surprise. So we found it interesting that the jays were surprised. They were fooled by magic effects, just like humans, when hands moved like wings. But when hands capitalized on the finger and opposable thumb, they weren't surprised. And of course, jays don't have fingers and thumbs. They don't have hands. And feathers don't work like fingers with opposable thumbs. So then, and that work was published in Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences and in Science. And so we then thought, well, the next obvious step is to look at monkeys, because monkeys have hands. And some monkeys do have opposable thumbs and some monkeys don't. And we found that the monkeys that don't have opposable thumbs, like marmosets, for example, behaved like the jays. They weren't fooled by them. Whereas monkeys that have opposable thumbs, like capuchin monkeys, were fooled just like humans. So it really looks like there is this other thing we need to be considering when we think about intelligence or cognition, which is its embodiment, the embodied knowledge that we have from having expectations about the world that are built on the body schema we have. The expectations you have if you have hands, or if you have opposable fingers and thumbs, or you have wings, or you have 8 kinds of arms. I can't do it because I'm right. 2 of an octopus or a cuttlefish or a squid might fundamentally change some of the assumptions you make about how you think the world works, what you think you saw, what you think you remembered, what kind of expectations you build about the causal world, the cause and effect. I know that button turns my Zoom on and off, and that one on this meeting. I don't know how they work, but I know which button to press. Or other kinds of cause and effect relationships. I know how to open a door to move out of a room, but I also understand that if the door is locked, I need to get the key first and unlock the door in order to open it. But all those things are assumptions, and we base our assumptions on the fact that we have fingers and thumbs, opposable thumbs for that matter, but also that the sensory world we live in is largely visual and acoustic. We're not very good at smell, but for some other animals, maybe vision isn't their primary sense and smell is. And maybe they don't have arms or wings or hands at all. Maybe they have paws, maybe they have something completely different. You know, an earthworm doesn't have arms or paws or wings, or so I think some of those things also need to feed back into the mix. And I think that for me is what some of the magic effects showed us, because they tap into blind spots, as we call them, because we're so visual, we call them blind spots in seeing. and roadblocks in thinking. Other animals might not call them blind spots. I don't know. They might call them dead spots or
Yeah.
whatever is the equivalent for something that's only olfactory or
Mm.
But I think we need to think a bit more about how intelligence, problem solving, how we think, what we think we saw, what we think we remember, how we anticipate the future, are all informed by the kinds of bodies we have and the kinds of sensory capabilities we have, not just brains, but even though, of course, I'm the first to admit brains are very important, but all these other things go into that information processing.
Yeah, I'm wondering if this bias that with embodied phenomenology, embodied cognition, that we're only trying to really counter this in the last couple of years. Of course, there's early advocates of those ideas, but maybe it's this old idea that of scientists or philosophers being not very physically active. They just sit on a desk and then thinking happens there. But that's not how cognition evolved, clearly. It
No,
is.
absolutely not. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
I remember those lovely TED Talks where it's like, well, no, your brain is not just a vat. Your body is not just like a car to
Yeah.
carry your brain around it. But you're talking to the wrong person. I'm a movement junkie, so
Yeah, perhaps we can talk about your dancing career a little bit. When did you start dancing?
well, again, I would say from when I was 4, because that's when I started
Yeah.
ballet lessons. My mum would say from when I was 18 months old. So the moment I realized that I could use legs, I didn't have to just shuffle on my bottom.
Yeah.
I was never a knee fan. I crawling, just forget it. That was just a waste of time as far as I was concerned. But the moment I realized that legs could be come in handy and do things, then I was off dancing, and I've been dancing ever since.
Hmm. Did you ever consider not pursuing an academic career and just focusing completely on dance?
Yes, but I realized that the problem with that is that as my body got older, I'd probably not be able to dance anymore.
Hmm.
I was on the phone with Mark Baldwin this morning. He was the former artistic director of Rambert and now runs Mark Baldwin Company's OBE, world famous choreographer, and all that jazz. We've been working together for over 50 years now. And he was, talking about some of the best dancers we know. And probably a couple of the top males are 51, but I don't think you can get much beyond that. Maybe 55 is the maximum to
Yeah.
be professional ballet or contemporary dance.
You can keep dancing, but perhaps no longer at the top level. Right.
Yeah, and you can do other forms of dance. So one of the dances I do is tango.
Mm-hmm.
Do that to a much older level. And I still do ballet but not at a top level. You can
Is
do
it
tango later,
is it
but
because it's more stressful on the joints than other forms of
uh,
dance? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, being on point is quite grueling.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's your hips and your ankles, and it's all your joints as well. It's
Hmm.
not just the bones, I think. But it does give you a different view of the world, I think. And I, so long as I can wiggle, I will always dance. However, I
Yeah, I think there's lots of research coming now out on say healthy aging and how we can stay mentally fit, and movement is very important for the brain.
yeah, yeah, absolutely,
Hmm.
absolutely, yeah, yeah. Um, I think exercise in general is very good.
Hmm.
I think if you want a healthy mind, it helps if you've got a healthy body.
Yeah. Now, perhaps for animals in captivity, if when you
Yeah.
started out with your early research, as a PhD student, were the enclosures for animals much smaller? I wonder if that would make the brain smaller as well, given how
Well,
they...
it's an interesting point, Walter, because people have, of course, said that animals in captivity can have smaller brains, and you wonder because they're in smaller worlds. I mean,
Yeah.
when I started out, people were happy to keep birds in tiny cages. I don't do that, as you know, because
Yeah.
I'm really into welfare and conservation as well. And our ovaries are 30 meters long, so
Yeah.
we call them a cage, but it's not quite the same size. At least they have lots of opportunity to fly. But I do think it makes a big difference. We also try to build in also kinds of enrichment so they don't get bored, which is why you see all kinds of bizarre and silly toys and boxes and bits and pieces in the aviaries, because I think it's good for the animals to be able to explore.
That's right. I mean, you've met Hedda Browning, my partner, now wife.
Yes.
Yeah, and we've just written a book on what are zoos for, and a lot of people are very critical of zoos. Some think they should be abolished completely. But at least for, per se, some animals, if they have a lot of, say, enrichment devices, there might actually be more cognitive stimulation in such a captive environment than they might get in the wild.
Well, if you're constantly stressed, you're not going to be able to think straight.
That's right,
As a
yeah.
human being. So, if there are things that other non-human animals share with us about stress, then presumably if you've got enrichment and reduced stress, that can only be a good thing, right?
I think some of the experiments you've done with monkeys, capuchins, that has been done in zoos?
It was in wildlife parks, actually.
Yeah.
Zoo-like things. Yeah.
Similar.
Yeah, and the people that worked there were brilliant, and I think it went well for everybody, because I think it was enrichment for the non-human primates, for example, the capuchins and the squirrel monkeys, but it was also enrichment for the Homo sapiens, the human trainers. They loved watching Eli's magic effects, and Eli really well. I mean,
that's right.
Eli's is such a wonderful, bubbly, social character. I mean, who wouldn't want to watch him perform monkey
That's right, yeah.
magic? So,
I guess there's another
it was
reason.
magic for monkeys, but the human monkeys were really enjoying it just as the genuine monkeys. I suspect. I can merely philosophize about that.
I mean, it's the same reason that people like to watch perhaps strange behaviors of animals on YouTube and the like.
Yeah.
Those kind of videos get a lot of views, right? I guess it speaks to another problem for comparative cognition research, that in a way it's much more expensive than, say, getting human participants sometimes to do some experiment, right?
Yes. Yeah.
What do you think, perhaps to try to approximate that, if you try to run some experiment with perhaps human infants and then Corvids perhaps, what are the costs if you're trying to run a very similar experiment?
Well, the costs, if you're looking at human infants or older children, school children, you can do it either in people's houses or in the schools those children go to. So you have no facility costs. You just have to go there. Obviously, there's managing people's time, but there's no housing issues. The current cost for 30 birds in my facility, it is a Corvid palace after all. So, it is the Ritz-Carlton. It's not, the travel lodge for the Corvids. But after much negotiation to decrease the cost to about a third of what originally have been charged, I'm still having to pay £100,000 a year. That's very expensive for 30 birds. If you do the maths of one bird per year, that's,
It's impressive.
Massive costs. Now we need to pay those costs because how are we going to study cognition in these highly intelligent birds if we don't give them the optimal welfare?
Yeah.
If they're completely stressed out, I'll be able to say Jays can't do this and Jays can't do that and Rooks can't do that and Rooks can't do that. You know, the only way, if they don't do it because they're stressed, it tells you absolutely nothing about their cognitive abilities other than that you're being a horribly cruel, insensitive, thoughtless person. Great. I'd love to have all those labels attributed to my name. No, thank you very much. But you know, if your animals are long-lived and they seem to be happy and healthy, who knows how we measure happiness, but if they seem to be living a long time and looking in good shape mentally and physically, then that's probably things going in the right direction. Well, to do that, it costs a lot of money. And as you know, I mean, my lab was nearly closed down a couple of years ago. And huge thanks to the general public as well as the university for support to enable to get all this money to keep facilities going. But it's very difficult to justify. You know, you could be applying for a grant and go, well, I can keep my standard pigeon or rat according to university regulations and home office regulations in these facilities, and it costs, you know, £30 or £50 or whatever. Why? How can you possibly justify 100,000 a year? And that's with the university subsidising it. So total cost is closer to 300,000 a year. So
I was about to ask how funders are reacting to this, because they might not have this deep insight into the disciplinary differences, the problems of comparative cognition. They just see this massive number and think, well, we can't fund this.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, but all the funders that have contributed, and there are many, and to any of you who are listening, big thank you. I'm so grateful. So we have raised the money to save the birds, thank goodness. But you know, how could I justify to a funding body the absolute cost of £280,000 a year for 30 birds? Now, the university, as I say, have been very kind and said, we'll only charge you 100,000. And the general public have been very kind, very generous and very wonderful, contributing all this money to allow that to happen. So big thank you to both the university and the general public for helping me save my birds and keep this going. But it is a massive amount of money. And how do you justify it other than to say, well, that's what it costs? What other argument can I give? Is there another way of doing it? Well, I don't know another way of doing it. You know,
I guess for the future, we might think it might be worth developing these closer connections to wildlife parks and zoos, where we might have better housing for those animals and then involve them on research. Because as it is, research is actually a very small part of zoos, but potentially that could be a much bigger part in the future, right?
Well, I think that's a great idea. I think the one problem with some of the cognitive experiments is the kind of controls you need. So, you know, for some of the work I've done, I need to make sure that some of my animals, some of my jays have been able to steal other birds' caches, others been prevented, or some of them have had experience of a food type, others never had. And that might be a lot more difficult for the zoos to manage, unless this collaboration was done from the outset and things were put in place. Yes, that's one of the difficulties, is the controls, because I think it would be brilliant to have researchers a much more prominent profile in the zoos. And we know of a number of research institutes that have led the way with this. Edinburgh University in the UK, for example, Max Planck in Germany as another, and that's brilliant. But obviously, I think knowing the setups well enough to be able to make the kinds of controls you need is one thing that would need careful planning. And another thing that would need careful planning is how the researchers get time to do the research versus when the visitors get time to visit the zoos. Those to me seem to be, they're not insurmountable problems, but they are two factors that probably need to be considered, right?
And I suppose zoos have, in a way, the same problem, that they're chronically underfunded. So how can they justify spending money on research instead of, say, improving the enclosures or conservation efforts?
Well, maybe they're the kinds of research that need priority with the zoos. You know, we have research that's deliberately and purposefully posed to be about things like enrichment and other welfare, and things that are purposely designed to be questions about conservation.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, most research going on in zoos is focused on those questions. But to get these connections with scientists at universities going, I think there would have to be more focus on non-zoo specific questions, right?
Well, I think that's where cognition's so important, because, you know, especially with long-lived, big-brained animals, we assume that cognition would play quite a big role in enrichment, because it won't just be physical enrichment, it'll also be mental enrichment, and knowing how those things go hand in hand and when they contradict one another is presumably key. Same as with conservation, you know, all the stuff, for example, with the Hawaiian crows, and looking at what kinds of re-release mechanisms will and won't work based on thinking about elements of cognition need to be built into your framework about conservation. So I guess more generally, collaboration is going to be key, that having people from different disciplines contribute their expertise and wisdom, and working out how those things can be shared for the general greater good is going to be important.
Yeah, you mentioned welfare as well. Now, unfortunately, crows are still often seen as pests, but have you seen a change in the public perception over the years in our attitudes to birds?
Yes, I have, thankfully. I mean, there are still people that catch them in larceny traps, and I think that's incredibly cruel, and cold-hearted. Not cool as in it's cool, but cool as in cold-hearted and cruel. But I think a lot of people initially see crows as evil. In general, people don't like birds that are black coloured. Whereas brightly coloured birds is considered, you know, prettier, more beautiful, kinder, nicer, generally better in whatever sense we evaluate good.
We contrapose white doves as sort of the peace symbol.
Peace, and the black crows are the evil, the harbingers of death and all the rest of it. But no, I think a lot of people, I mean, I've had so many gifts and kind words from people saying how amazed they are by the cleverness of the Corvids. You can see a few examples I turn behind me on the shelves of people that have drawn me pictures, given me gifts, sent me little messages, sent me books. There's one there, Grandma's Grabber, Hello Crow. Is that
oh, that's wonderful.
There's the story of the three-legged crows. So there's a beautiful lady in London called Peiru Chen who painted me a beautiful picture of the fable of the three-legged crow. And in Japan, the legs stand for past, present, and future. In China, where Peiru is originally from, it's all about the fact that the crows are so clever, they're not frightened by fire. They come into the human communities and use the smoke to fumigate their wings. And then they roost in the darkness. But then in the morning, as the sun rises, at dawn, they fly into the sky across the sun and become the golden
Oh,
crow,
fascinating. Yeah.
the
I get,
crow, hope, and the future.
I suppose you get sent a lot of emails with perhaps anecdotes or videos where they sort of describe surprising behaviors.
I do, and for everyone listening, thank you so much, and please keep sending them. They make my world. I really value them. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of what every researcher would wish for, to have really this connection to the public, because I guess for the vast majority of scientists, you might not see the direct application, but there's so many people who respond to your work. Right?
Yeah, I'm so grateful. I really am. Means the world.
Hmm. Now, for the future, do you have any exciting questions you want to investigate?
Um, well, there's several things with the Corvids, with looking in more detail about other aspects of memory
Mm-hmm.
that have been found in humans. So, for example, I'd like to know whether, like humans, the crows can remember the source of the memory.
Hmm.
So you might say, well, when did we last meet? Oh, well, I remember that when that was, because I remember what you were wearing, or I remember when you
Hmm.
and Heather came round to our post-Christmas potluck party, for
Yeah.
example. Um, so you know that it's not just a fact, and it's an experiential memory,
Hmm.
but you remember how you know it. I remember because I saw you, and I remember the occasion, the party. Um, or you might say, well, I remember it because I read it in the newspaper, or I read it online,
Hmm.
or I heard it on the radio, um, or I was going for a drink with Eli and he told me over a glass of red wine, or you remember the context. But often you remember also things like whether you saw it, or you read it, or you heard it. I'd
Hmm.
like to be able to test something like that with the Jays. For example, did they see it? How did they know it? Did they see it, or did they hear it? We've done something similar with the cuttlefish, not with hearing, because that's not their forte, but did they see it, or did they smell it? So I'd like to do something like that. And I'd
Hmm.
also like to do some magic effects with the cuttlefish.
Oh, yeah, that's going to be difficult, I suppose, to implement.
I think it's going to be fun. So I think we can
Hmm.
use dynamic camouflage and look at
Ah,
how
yeah.
they, when and how and where and when they choose to hide themselves under different
Hmm.
lighting conditions.
Interesting.
So I think that's going to be very cool.
Yeah.
I think that looking at different animals, particularly ones that seem to be so alien to us in the sense that their brains are so different, their bodies are so different, the way they live their lives are so different, can be really informative and help us just avoid being anthropomorphic or
Hmm.
anthropocentric. You know, as a human, I do it this way. As a completely different animal, maybe I do it just as well or even better or worse,
Hmm.
but with a different kind of body.
Yeah, so we have exciting research coming
So
out.
hopefully, watch this space. Bye bye, Moriarty.
So I guess we can expect some interesting research coming out of your lab in the next year. So let's perhaps move to the final question.
Sure.
If there's any, say, students who look at your work and think, oh, this work seems spectacular. Engaging with animals, trying to probe their abilities, building connections with the animals. We haven't really gone into that. But when I was in your lab, I really noticed how it was important for the members of your lab that worked with the animals to really establish connections with them in order to do the
Yeah.
research. But yeah, what would you say to people who want to pursue this kind of work? Would you encourage them? How would you tell them how to go about it?
Of course I would encourage them. And I wouldn't be too prescriptive because
Hmm.
you have to do it in the way that resonates with you. But I think a good starting point is really to get to know your animal. to really spend a lot of time watching them, listening to them, hanging out with them. You know, as far as I'm concerned, it's a real privilege and a pleasure to work with our Corvids in the Corvid Palace. And we've spent hours and hours watching them, hanging out with them, playing with them, respecting them, trusting them. And if you're lucky and you do that long enough, they will also trust and respect you. And that will give you such a privileged window into their mind that you never otherwise get. But if they're frightened, if they don't want to hang out with you, you're just going to miss so much. It takes years and years and hours of time, but it's time well spent, because if you're blessed enough to have a window into their minds because they trust you and respect you enough, gosh, what you get is just
yeah.
I don't know how else to explain it. I wouldn't have spent this number of years of my life doing it if I didn't feel like that. But, you know, if you watch any of the material on YouTube or other videos and MPEGs and whatever of us with the birds, you'll see the close connection we have. Just watch the magic movies with Eli on New Scientist, and the jays are so tame, they come up and pet your thumb. And then you open your hand and they are either surprised or not about what they see in your hand. Well, you can't just walk into the garden and go, I'm going to stand there with a worm or a nut in my hand and do this. You're not going to get any birds doing that in a moment. It takes years and years, but it's so worth it. And of course, we see this in the wild crows as well. I can go to Parker's Piece with a bag of peanuts, which I often do, and feed the crows, and they bring me presents. And they seem to understand that I'm vegetarian. I get no roadkill. I get bottle tops, wine corks, walnuts, all kinds of lovely gifts. But they even seem to have clocked that the kind of gifts that I'm going to be like, that's wonderful, thank you. And I think I might be, you know, I haven't eaten meat since I'm 11, so I'm not about to start eating roadkill or any other kind of animal now, although from ethical grounds, I'd be more likely to eat roadkill than eat supermarket, but, you know, I'd rather not. But wine corks, bottle tops, walnuts, sure, bring them on. So, you know, but you see the special relationship that they bring you gifts. And there's an amazing young lady, she must be 16 or 17 now, in California, who was feeding the birds, and there were loads of stories about her in the New Scientist shortly before the pandemic, of all these crows that would bring her gifts. And her mum lost her wedding ring, and the crows found it and brought it back and put it in the So, you know, but those relationships that you can build, they mean the world. Because, you know, you have to remember, we are animals, and we're highly social animals, and we love to hang out with others and share our stories, verbally and non-verbally.
Yeah, what a wonderful final message. So thanks so much, Nikki, for coming on this podcast. I'm very glad you came, and I hope you all enjoyed this episode. We'll see you again.
Absolutely. See you again.